So let's talk about some towering walking battle fortresses, titanic battle tanks, and some gargantuan flyers, with an overview for the big Forge World Titans for every faction that has them in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd delve into the Imperial armor compendiums and talk through some incredibly expensive hunks of resin with some truly crazy stats in game, taking a look at Forge World Titan class units out there in Warhammer 40k. Alongside all the units that you might expect to see in more normal style games of Warhammer 40k. Over the years, Games Workshop have created a number of supersized units in Forge World resin, ranging from things like the Space Marine Astraeus to the Tau Supremacy armor or the Ork Gargantuan Squiggoth. And in this video I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the single biggest Forge World creation for every faction, going over a quick look at their model, the price from the Warhammer web store, and roughly what it does in game. I feel like the majority of these are kind of deliberately kept niche so they don't dominate any sort of optimized army list, but some of them are certainly more interesting than others. For the purposes of this video, I thought we'd focus exclusively on Forge World things, so it wouldn't be including the Games Workshop plastic super heavies, and talk through the single biggest thing that each faction can field. Lots of crazy outsized models to talk about, so let's jump straight in. First up, and starting with a big one, we have the Warlord Titan. With the various parts that you need to build the model, you need to select the top guns, side weapons, and helmets and things. This adds up to a fairly monumental £1,600 or $2,500 US, the single most expensive Warhammer miniature that Games Workshop produces. The scale of the thing isn't entirely obvious from the picture of the model, but you can see a little size comparison on the bottom left here. Questoris Knights come up to around about knee high on this guy. It does tower over the battlefield to a truly ridiculous extent. These guys represent a large and powerful battle titan, one of the bigger classes in the lore, and certainly the biggest that Games Workshop has produced. Firepower more than capable of targeting and destroying its peers. In game you can field it with either any Imperium or Chaos army. I think technically Genius of the Cults are able to field these as well, if you somehow just made the army entirely out of Brood Brothers, and then you could ally one along. In-game, the single biggest and most expensive model in Warhammer 40k clocks in at a massive 3,500 points, basically equivalent to almost 2 for Warhammer 40k tournament armies there. For that kind of ridiculous investment, you get a casual 100 wounds at toughness 16 with a 2+ save. Big heavy things like las cannons are going to be wounding this on a 5+, and the stats on the guns that it can pack are kind of silly. You get the choice of 2 armed weapons and a couple of really big carapace weapons, both of which are massively threatening. But no matter what the selection, it will pretty much flatten whatever it looks at. I do quite like the highlight though of the Ariok Power Claw being 6 attacks at strength 20 and a crazy damage 24. Just one swing of that thing capable of flattening a standard sized knight. Obviously the points cost of this thing are just so far beyond the scope of normal games that it's just a big centerpiece for ridiculous, fluffy, enormous confrontations, so perhaps exact power isn't exactly the be-all and end-all here. For damage output, I feel like perhaps the single most exciting gun might be the Volcano Cannon, that averages you some pretty ridiculous numbers against whatever you fire at, should comfortably delete any normal tank that you point it at, and even to an enemy Warlord Titan. Volcano Cannons average a crazy 33 wounds. You get an average of 5 shots at strength 32, AP 5 and damage 18, though if you want to be a bit more general purpose against heavy infantry, that plasma cannon is quite a good one as well. It is pretty silly seeing a plasma cannon at strength 12 and damage 8 with an average of 13 shots. Perhaps in a bit more of a scope that's consistent with more standard 40k, we've next got the Space Marine Astraeus. I thought for a few of these armies we'd mention both the big tank and the big flyer version, given that they maybe feel a bit different in scope. At £265 or $410, this one's the Primaris Super Heavy, basically a massively upscaled version of the Repulsor chassis. Big hefty grav plates that aim to make this thing a stable firing platform on the move, packing a big macro accelerator cannon for a rapid strike super heavy as they go. Even being a big grav tank though, it doesn't skimp on the armour, having big armour and some void shields to protect against enemy fire. In game, the Astraeus is 525 points, and that macro accelerator cannon is maybe kind of general purpose, 12 shots at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3 with sustained hits and twin linked. I do feel like it perhaps could have used a bit more AP to be honest. It's just the sort of gun with that sort of scale that I'd expect to be at least AP 2. Otherwise though, the sponsons are pretty ferocious as well, with a bunch of either las cannon or plasma style shots. and its durability is okay, maybe somewhat similar to Questoris or Dominus Knights. Space Marines do have a lot of firepower support. You could easily get +1 to hit from this with things like a Tech Marine or maybe some Incursors, and could be a focal target for things like Ironstorm Spearhead stratagems. I'd say the biggest weaknesses are low AP on the main gun, and the fact that it just has a ridiculously enormous model profile means that it can often struggle to move past terrain, and that can be an issue for boards with any sort of preset terrain out there. In general, you're probably better off with its equivalent in smaller, hard-hitting tanks. I feel like it's perhaps a little bit more usable than some. Perhaps the true heavyweight for the Space Marines, though, is the mighty and iconic Thunderhawk, £575 and $890. This really is a Titanic flyer kit, often in the background for one of the main ways that Space Marines get to battle, a void-capable drop aircraft packing some fairly ferocious firepower for essentially a transport, capable of delivering a big broadside of missiles and firing off its macro accelerator cannon as it delivers its cargo of power-armoured heroes into the heart of the fray. It is kind of funny that one of the earlier incarnations of this used to be cast in metal and was a model that was almost impossible to assemble without some good technical know-how, kind of liable to destroy itself under its sheer own weight. In-game, the Thunderhawk clocks in at 840 points. That gives you 30 wounds worth of toughness 12 flyer with a 2+ save. It does have hover mode, so it can start on the board. Its big transport capacity can hold 30 Marines, and it has the interesting special rule where it gets the sort of assault ramp style special rule if you've got deep strike on your units. So if you moved it up the board, then you could have Terminators or Assault Marines and things charge straight out of it. A pretty reliable way to deliver into first turn combat there. It gets the choice between two exciting top guns, either one that's a bit more medium infantry killing or the turbo laser that's better at anti-armor, plus a few Hellstrike missiles and las cannons and things. Overall, unfortunately, at 840 points, I feel like it is just a bit overcosted for what it brings. Even if it does have some crazy stats, I'd say that neither its damage nor defense are particularly exciting for that kind of points cost, and using its transport capacity means that you're throwing even more points into this thing. Still, though, cool to have such a big, crazy Astartes flyer. I wonder if Games Workshop will ever deliver on the meme of a full-scale plastic Thunderhawk at some point, rather than just an Aeronautica Imperialis style one. Sticking with Titanic flyers for a second, and next up we have the Astra Militarum's Marauder planes, the Marauder Bomber and the Marauder Destroyer. These things are essentially the heavy attack aircraft of the Imperial Navy and Aeronautica Imperialis, the Marauder Bomber being perhaps the more standard tactical heavy bomber, and the Marauder Destroyer being developed in the War of Armageddon, more reconfigured as a tank hunter with some dangerous missiles. The scale of these is pretty enormous once more. You can see a comparison versus them and a Lehman Ross on the bottom left. These guys get 2 datasheets. Here's the bomber one for 345 points. Unfortunately, probably out of most of the things that we're talking about today, this one might be one of the more overcosted for what it does. Its durability being kind of okay at toughness 10 and a 2+ save with 20 wounds. It can chip in with a few guns, but nothing that would really make you want to pay 345 points for it. Its main rule is its bombing rule, which Games Workshop really seem to have got wrong for most 10th edition things. You need to start with this off the board, then it turns up turn 2, and then at earliest you could be bombing turn 3, and even then you might only be getting something like 4 or 5 mortal wounds at best. Out of the two, I think the Marauder Destroyer, which is a bit pricier, is the better of them, but even then its damage output doesn't really get into being good, particularly as you're not far off being able to afford something like a Baneblade chassis tank for the same sort of cost. Speaking of which, given that we're talking about super heavies, I thought it was worth mentioning the Stormblade, the great big plasma Baneblade that is the only one that isn't in the core codex, and it's a resin model and you can't make it out of the standard Baneblade kit, even if that does make the crazy Octoblade 8 different configurations. This thing was initially the brainchild of the plasma specialist of the AdMech of Riser, a super heavy plasma gun where I'd imagine that if things go wrong with that, they go wrong in a big way. And this one would set you back £160 or $245, significantly more than a standard Baneblade, but perhaps a little bit less so than some resin comparisons. This one's like an extra 60% more, where I feel like quite a lot of plastic versus resin comparisons often mean that you're paying like double the cost for Forge World resin. In-game, interesting enough, despite feeling like maybe a bit more of an arcane and relic version of a Baneblade, this one actually costs significantly less in points. The great big plasma cannon getting you d6 plus 3 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 4, of course with hazardous. Otherwise it comes with the same fairly decent defensive profile for the Baneblade, 24 wounds at toughness 13 with a 2+ save, plenty of secondary weapons with the las cannon and heavy bolt sponsons which you can take 4 sets of, and the great big plasma cannon even gets to reroll hit rolls within 24-inch range, which I think is one of the better special rules out of them. Between all this, provided you're actually playing on a table where you can maneuver this thing somewhat, then I feel like it's actually really not a bad unit for the guard at all. A super heavy that can take good synergies like being ordered by Lord Solar, and puts out some scary general purpose firepower with an inbuilt hit reroll. Next up we've got the Imperial Knights, and for the knightly household, the Acastus Knights are the biggest ones. The Acastus Knight Astraeus as pictured here, or swapping out for the Magna las cannons of the Porphyrion. This big boy is many times the cost of a regular knight, £400 per model or $620, where a standard Questoris is around about £100/$160. These are enormous relic knight suits that are in short supply even amongst the most renowned knight households. The Astraeus pattern is armed with mighty conversion beamers, relic weapons in themselves, and fantastically terrifying at chewing through enemy tanks, armour and fortifications. In game, the Acastus Knights got a points discount kind of recently. The Astraeus for the Imperial Knights clocks in at 765 points, and that gets you a toughness 13 profile with 30 wounds and a 2+ save. Those twin conversion beam cannons just being fairly god tier anti-vehicle. 3 shots each hitting on a 3+, strength 16, AP 2 and damage 6, and it gets sustained hits D3, triggering that on a 4+ if you're outside of 24-inch range. As per normal, conversion beamers need to be a little bit further away to warm up. They're twin linked, so they're almost always going to be wounding their targets, and they get extra strength and damage if they're targeting vehicles or fortifications. Overall, these guys are kind of lesser played compared with other knight variants, both for Imperial and Chaos, but I'd basically rate them as knights that destroy knights. If you're expecting to be facing enemy super heavies or other extremely tough vehicle units, then these guys could be a devastating centerpiece unit just to destroy things turn after turn. They maybe are competing with things like the Castellan and Knight Tyrant for the role with their Volcano Lancers and being quite a bit cheaper. For the Adeptus Custodes, they have access to the Ares and Orion gunships and dropships, enormous flyers that don't actually have the Titanic tag but have a stat line that is pretty much the same as a knight. They're £350 or $540, big relic gunships for the Custodes, protected by eclipse shields that absorb light when they take fire, shrouding the aircraft in a pall of darkness that protects against enemy fire as they can't see where to shoot next. The Ares variant pictured here focuses more on heavy firepower with the Arachnus Blaze weaponry, and the Orion variant is an assault dropship with a transport capacity. As you'd expect for enormous war machines from the Adeptus Custodes, these guys cost a very high number of points, 580 points for the Ares, and has the stat line quite similar to a Questoris Knight with a 2+ save. Its toughness 12 and 22 wounds. I'd say its defense maybe isn't quite a standout, though I do think its damage is pretty scary indeed. With those blaze cannons, you get a big 8 shots hitting on a 2+ that are essentially las cannon firepower. It's going to be hitting really accurately with those, and then a really big gun with 3 shots with the Magna Blaze cannon at strength 18, AP 4, and a big damage D6+6. Even one failed save against that could threaten to just eliminate one tank or enemy war machine. Besides that, it does have a bombing attack as well, though I'd say that's far less interesting than the big guns. Overall, probably a few too many eggs in one big basket really, though some armies might really struggle to deal with it if they don't have anti-tank firepower that can reach out and destroy this. It maybe is a little bit dependent on having suitably valuable units for it to remove from the board. If you're fighting against a lot of medium or light infantry, you might struggle to get enough value out of that heavy anti-tank to really justify its huge cost. Finally, for the Imperium and for completeness, given that the Grey Knights do have some Forge World access, they've got access to the Thunderhawk gunship as well. But for actual unique stuff, they do have their own Forge World class of Land Raider. The Land Raider Banisher is £90 or $140, essentially a risen upgrade kit for a standard Land Raider, giving the unit some heavy incinerators and a twin Psy Cannon. Interestingly, I noticed that it had been branded as the Grey Knight Land Raider Redeemer on the web store. I guess besides the Psy Cannon, it is kind of close to that. Unfortunately, in-game, I'd say the Land Raider Banisher just is badly balanced versus the Redeemer at the moment. It's only 5 points cheaper at 255 points, but its guns are just far less threatening than the Flamestorm cannons. It loses a bit of AP and a pip of damage, and still spits out fairly similar numbers of shots. The Psy Cannon versus the Heavy Bolter on the whole does get a +3 strength, but it isn't really worth the trade-off for the 5 points. I think I would just be tempted to proxy this in as a Land Raider Redeemer if you have one. For Chaos, rather unfortunately, Games Workshop do seem to have set out on a purge of their Forge World models over the translation from 9th edition to 10th. To some extent, I do get the idea of keeping the Horus Heresy datasheets more to the Heresy with things like Contemptor Dreadnoughts and Leviathans, even if I think it would have been more fun if they kept them around, even if they didn't make them super optimal or anything. What felt like far more of a weird and slightly sad decision, though, was to remove any of the bigger themed demon engines from current Chaos Space Marines, things like the Greater Brass Scorpion, the Chiton Ravager, given that to my mind they weren't really particularly associated with the Horus Heresy in the past. Chaos Space Marines got into their demon engines to a much greater extent later in the more current setting. For me, I generally associated things like the Greater Brass Scorpion far more with 40k than Heresy. It just felt very odd that lots of Xenos got to keep their super heavies in 40k, such as Aeldari, Orks, or Necrons, whereas Chaos were for some reason specifically told no and had their rules sent to Legends. Obviously, that doesn't mean that they're actually unplayable. I feel like the majority of games where you'd actually want to run these, you might be playing to a bit more of a casual level, and Legends rules are absolutely fair game. Just seemed a bit sad not to keep them a little bit more mainstream and keep the rules and points updated, even if people didn't tend to use them super regularly. Just for one big example of a cool model that got sent to the Legends rule set for 40k is the Greater Brass Scorpion. This enormous Cornate Demon engine is still on sale at £205 or $315. A Titanic Demon engine of the Blood God, disturbingly agile for its size, and particularly excels at hunting enemies dug deep into fortifications, ripping apart such defences with its enormous claws. For the Legends rules for this monstrosity, it's 555 points, kind of has a stat line similar to things like Questoris or Abhorrent Knights. Toughness 12, 26 wounds, a 3+ save with an invulnerable, and moves fairly quickly at 12 inches. For its weapons, it gets a fairly scary Demolisher Cannon, a Torrent Strength 8 Flamer, and that big Scorpion Tail Cannon is essentially 5 heavy bolters lashed together with sustained hits. Then when it gets to combat, it's got kind of Knight scale melee, 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 3 and damage 6, traded out for a sweep attack to butcher enemy Space Marines. Its Cornate Demon heritage gives you a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds and psychic attacks, which feels all very appropriate and can be quite a good way of damaging this. And its damage might be a bit more impressive than you might expect, given that you can always make dark packs for either extra sustained or lethal hits. Overall, quite a fun rule set here. I feel like at 555 points it's maybe not doing quite enough to justify that sort of high points cost, though it doesn't look like it to be completely unusable more casually. Getting on to the Xenos Titan equivalents next though, and first up we have the Aeldari Phantom Titan. £630 or $975 with the weapons for this great big striding Wraithbone constructs, massively bigger than a Wraith Knight, and as ever with the Aeldari, notably swift and agile compared with the lumbering behemoths of the Imperium. Phantom Titans are forged out of the psychically active Wraithbone, and each one of these war machines contains the living spirits of its previous pilots within. The current Aeldari pilot's going into a trance-like state to pilot the great war machine alongside his forebears. As the massively crazy price tag would suggest, as much as in some entire Warhammer 40k armies, this thing is one of the bigger titans, moving very quickly at 14 inches, a massive toughness 14 with 55 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save against ranged attacks. I feel like the most interesting guns for it would be the Phantom Pulsars, great big anti-tank weapons that you can see modelled, 8 shots each at strength 18, AP 4 and a damage 6 to utterly flatten whatever tank it gets pointed at. It backs that up with a Voidstorm missile launcher which is fairly general purpose, and you can give it some fairly threatening melee with the enormous Wraithglaive. Scary Titan class melee at a big damage 12. Again, at the big points cost it's not really relevant for more normal games of Warhammer 40k, but if you were running one then this seems like an auto-include to focus big focal buffs for certain units around it. You can give it things like a -1 to wound from a nearby Farseer, or other interesting things with stratagems or other focal unit boosts. I'm sure pretty terrifying when it's guided by the psychic powers of one of the race's commanders. Moving on to the greenskins, and currently the biggest and baddest Forge World unit around is the Gargantuan Squiggoth. Though kind of interestingly, Orks are pretty much the only race that has a miniature that feels sort of truly Titanic sort of scale, with the Stomper actually being in plastic. That one does absolutely dwarf other more traditional size super heavies, say like Imperial Knights and the like. And it is kind of funny that the big Stomper does stand a fair bit higher, kind of similar for overall mass I'd say, though the Stomper costs far more points, whereas the beloved walking Orky trash can that is the Stomper only costs £85. In any case, from Forge World with the expensive resin, the Gargantuan Squiggoth is a big £320 or $495. Really quite a cool model in my opinion, an enormous Orc Squig variant with massive tusks and a great howdah built on the back for Orcs to fire out of, pretty much feeling like the Orky equivalent of a supersized war elephant. When ridden to battle it can certainly demonstrate its ferocity, charging down its foes, trampling, goring, and often devouring the enemies that get in its way. In game, I think the Squiggoth has actually got quite an interesting datasheet. 440 points is less than some for the big super heavy things out here. Its toughness 13 with 30 wounds and a 3+ save, no invulnerable to keep it safe, but the high wound count and the high toughness does mean that some things might struggle to wound it that well. Its shooting I'd say is nothing to write home about. 2d6 shots at strength 12 and damage 3 would be good if you weren't hitting on a 5+. Really this thing is all about the melee. Kind of surprising that something Knight equivalent gets a big damage 12 on its huge tusks, and the sweep attack is pretty ferocious as well. Loads of things that'll kill Terminators nicely at strength 9, AP 2, and a flat damage 3. Orcs quite like their transports as well, and you could have this have a big mob of boys jump out of it, maybe Meganobs or Beastlanger boys or something, which isn't the worst either. Overall, maybe killed just a little bit too easily against the wrong matchup, and having quite so many points that are pretty much dedicated melee can be risky, but I feel like this guy's got a better and more usable datasheet than many at that kind of points cost. Onto the forces of the greater good, and first up for them we have the Taunar Supremacy armour, pretty much the Tau version of a Titan. This one's the biggest battlesuit around and clocks in at £317 or $489 once you've bought the additional weapons that you need to upgrade it and arm it. For the most part, Tau combat doctrine favours manoeuvrability quite a lot, but this thing is deployed when you just need to do all-out static defense against a foe with some enormous war machines like Imperial Titans or Tyranid Biotitans, firepower capable of destroying the most fearsome things that the enemy can field. As seems to be fairly standard for the Tau, you do get quite a lot of choice of weapons. It can pack things from pulse driver cannons and ion cannons or fusion eradicators on the arm weapons. In-game, the Supremacy armour is rather costly at 790 points. Its defense may be a little bit so-so for that cost at 30 wounds at toughness 13 with a 5+ invulnerable. Again, maybe falling into the sort of category where some armies are just not really going to be able to deal with it very efficiently and might choose to go after the rest of your force instead. It does hit on the standard Tau 4+, so it does need guiding, ideally with Tetras, and that can be kind of problematic given that with guided units you generally want to be firing against just one thing, and this is an awful lot of guns to be pointed against just one target. Otherwise, for damage profiles, the Fusion and Ion both have draws to them, depending on whether you want more shots but hazardous, or closer range, higher strength and damage. For the top guns, I'd probably be debating between the Railgun and the Fragmentation Launcher versus the Nexus missiles, depending on whether you want a whole load of strength 8 damage 2 shots or a couple of damage 16 wonder shots that are going to be crazily swingy depending on whether or not they puncture the armour or not. Overall, at least partly due to the guiding rules, I feel like you're generally going to be better off with multiple smaller units from the Tower compared with this guy. There is definitely an intimidating presence with a massive tough unit covered in guns. The Taunar is certainly not the biggest kit for the Tau Empire though, that's the Manta, a ridiculously enormous aircraft and one of the second most expensive kits in Warhammer 40K. I believe it's kind of similar to the Warbringer Nemesis Titan. This thing is truly enormous on a scale that's very different to most of the rest of this video. The Manta can cast a shadow over half a battlefield. That wingspan is 34 inches in diameter apparently, and it's around about 25 inches long or so. A ridiculously big piece of resin for around £1,200 or almost $2,000, and this thing is designed to be the supersized Tau transport dropship. I do like the fun crew details inside. There's a modelled bank of seated fire warriors showing just how big the hold is, plus for the main hold of the thing you can see a squadron of 4 tanks in there, plus 8 battlesuits side by side, basically a hunter cadre all ready for deployment out of just one big plane. Again, the Manta is one of the most costly miniatures in Warhammer 40k, 2,100 points for a 60 wound, toughness 14 flyer, as many points as an entire army put together for many again. Like the Tau Knight, it doesn't do too well with guiding, given that you will be wanting to split fire most likely. It gets no less than 6 ion cannons that you could fire at different things, all with fairly good general purpose profiles, and then 2 heavy rail cannons, each getting a strength 26 and damage 12 shot. Transport capacity is just kind of funny though, 200 infantry, 4 tanks and 8 battlesuits with 9 wounds or fewer. Kind of funny that you couldn't even max it out with standard fire warriors. If you're playing by normal datasheet restrictions, you can only take 6 squads of 10 of each. Again, an absolutely truly ridiculous flyer, and one that I'd be kind of worried about moving around to any extent whatsoever or playing with in game. You wouldn't want to be knocking this thing over on top of an entire army beneath it. Moving on to the hungry forces of the Tyranids, and they have 2 fairly equivalent big things. The Hierophant Bio-Titan stands on its curiously slender, scuttling legs, a gargantuan Tyranid apex predator packing some dire biocannons and a scary bioplasma attack, those forelimbs capable of skewering a tank and crushing it beneath its bulk. The high fleets might deploy 1 or more of these if the enemy has similar threats on this kind of scale, and in classic Tyranid symbiosis it can carry a great brood within it to be spawned out and protected against close attacks from enemy infantry. In game, the Hierophant is 810 points, comes with a very tanky defensive profile at 30 wounds, toughness 14 and a 2+ save, feeling maybe kind of equivalent with things like the Acastus Knights or the Tau Knight suit perhaps. It's got big, easy to use general purpose damage, 2 dire biocannons that will be striking with an average of 18 shots at strength 10, AP 3 and damage 3. Very nasty threats against heavy infantry like Custodes, Terminators or medium vehicles, and also has a bioplasma torrent to just burn down a squad of enemy infantry each turn. In combat it gets a bunch of d6+1 damage attacks plus some lash whip pods to slay enemy infantry, and as mentioned it can transport 20 Tyranid infantry of its own to jump out and fight enemy equivalents. Tyranids do have some interesting things that can help out any one unit as well. Getting a 5+ feel no pain if it's in synapse range from the invasion fleet stratagem is kind of massive. Pretty crazy to be able to essentially get an extra 50% on the durability of any one enormous model like that. Overall it's certainly intimidating, though the general thinking seems to be that you're better off with its equivalent in smaller units. You could say get 3 Exocrines and 3 Harspexes for that points cost if you just wanted a bunch of cheap monsters with damage dealing on the table. You are passing up quite a lot of resources for the high fleet by taking an 810 point thing. The other super big Tyranid beastie is the Harridan, £325 or $500 as well, an enormous Tyranid flying monster dragon-like beast, each wing kind of curiously tipped with an enormous biocannon, and it can transport a brood of gargoyles which are often seen clinging to its carapace. You really don't want one of these swooping down on your highest pillar of your hive city. A stat line for this thing maybe does have some similarities with the Hierophant. It's got 30 wounds, though it's easier to kill with its armour, only toughness 10 and a 3+ save this time. It does have massively increased speed though at 20 inches if it hovers, and kind of scarily you can get a +1 to wound for those dire biocannons if you used its frenzied metabolism rule. That will make them far more scary against things that are toughness 11 or 12, and have them wounding things like Custodes on a 2+ as well. I feel like with that rule its damage output is actually kind of good for 610 points. It's mainly the defense that is a bit of a letdown really. If the enemy can hit it with some big meaningful anti-tank, then this thing could get chipped apart surprisingly quickly for a huge 610 point investment. Again though, things like that Feel No Pain or any other focal Tyranid buffs could be quite nice for him. For the Necrons we have the Seraptek Heavy Construct. This enormous Canoptek thing is £244 or $377 once you've bought its armament. These are some of the ultimate Canoptek guardians that lie within the heart of a tomb world, often guarding the power core of the entire thing. Though occasionally adventurous overlords might decide to call upon the might of one to help them out in times of war. An enormous beast of living metal to plough its way towards the enemy and rip out the heart of a heavy fortification or massive defense line. It attacks with devastating forelimbs, side-mounted singularity generators or transdimensional projectors, and seems to hold sway over lesser canoptek entities in its presence. In game, the Seraptek is 540 points. This gives you 24 wounds at toughness 12 with a 3+ save and a 5+ invulnerable, again kind of equivalent to Questoris Knight sort of stats. It does cost significantly more than those though. For its primary weapons, you get 2 copies of either the Singularity Generators or the Transdimensional Projectors plus Synaptic Obliterators. An interesting sort of choice there, either getting just 2 really big general purpose weapons, or 4 guns, 2 of them being very scary anti-tank guns, and then a bunch of basically heavy bolter shots with strength 5 and damage 2. I feel like they're fairly well balanced, though I'd probably go with the Projector and Obliterator myself, maybe just dividing firepower a bit better, being able to take down some small units and some big ones in the same turn. Otherwise it gets Titanic forelimbs with a bunch of strength 14 damage 5 attacks, and can sweep as well, and its special rule is unfortunately a battle shock related one. I do find it kind of funny when a few of these really big monstrous creatures and big vehicles and things just have some sort of battle shock test. Maybe Games Workshop deciding that they didn't really need any extra power rather than their fairly ridiculous stats. Unfortunately for 540 points though, I feel like it's going to struggle to compete against the other Necron super heavies. Both the Tesseract Vault and the Monolith are interesting, the Monolith maybe particularly so for almost 200 points less. It still packs some heavy anti-tank firepower and is almost similarly tough, plus being able to do interesting teleport tricks, particularly in Hypercrypts. I would note that this thing doesn't have the Canoptek keyword as well, which might be kind of sensible really. Allowing a massive super heavy like this easy access to full rerolls in a detachment might be a recipe for it being unbalanced, ridiculously strong in there but kind of weak everywhere else. Finally, for our look through big resin things, we've got the Drukhari Tantalus, £120 or $185 from Forge World. This one is basically a huge assault skimmer, significantly bigger than a raider, and has a sort of twin hull catamaran sort of appearance with the massive scythe blades at the side of it, in a lore capable of slicing apart enemy battle tanks as it goes by. The Tantalus in game is the single cheapest model out of anything on this list, not really a super heavy, it's not Titanic or anything, just an unusually big assault skimmer. It's toughness 10 and 18 wounds with a 5+ invulnerable save, and strikes with pulse disintegrators, 12 shots at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 2. Quite a nice general purpose weapon that could be kind of handy for handing out pain tokens for. Not quite as vicious against heavy armour as the Dart Lance things, but that'll go through Space Marine infantry pretty readily. Otherwise it can transport 16 infantry, which means you could have interesting combinations of things inside it. Gets a bit of melee with those dire scythe blades, plus some interesting mortal wound impact hits. On a 4+ you get 3 when it charges in. I feel like this thing could be particularly interesting in the Sky Splinter Force. Lots of relevant stratagems for things jumping in and out of transports, firing out of transports, and supporting the skimmers themselves. In theory this could be a very efficient use of a pain token with a bunch of Cabalite warriors inside it firing out their guns. Be getting a lot of shooting both from the main thing and from the embarked unit. Very scary shooting all in all. Again, out of the units that I've talked about, I'd say that this one might be one of the most competitive. I have seen people using them in Sky Splinter lists. So with a look through the various Xenos Titans and monstrosities out there, that just about brings us to the end of our look through the Forge World supersized unit catalogue. I do find these enormous, impractical, very expensive things just kind of fun that they exist out there, even if they're not the sort of thing that I typically look to pick up for my own armies. For in-game power at the moment, I'd say perhaps the most relevant ones might be the Astra Militarum Stormblade, really quite cheap and effective for a Baneblade chassis, plus a big fun plasma gun, and that Drukhari Tantalus that we just talked about. Again, that one seems to get played in competitive lists from time to time. Otherwise, I feel like out of the rest, there's plenty of stuff that's at least kind of interesting. The Harridan and Biotitan, I think, aren't awful for the Tyranids. Same with that kind of spectacular damage 12 melee of the Ork Gargantuan Squiggoth, and the sheer armor busting potential of the Acastus Knights, even if you might be comparing those to things like the Tyrants and the Dominus class. Let me know your thoughts on any of these as either kits or units. Have you seen any of them take to the table in anger in 10th edition 40k so far? Look forward to hearing your battlefield reports down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.